Hey Gromies, welcome back. I'm Steve Geeter with Northcoast Horticulture Supply, and I'm here today to talk to you about how to dry, cure, and store your homegrown cannabis. The difference between drying and curing your cannabis is really slight, but I can break it down for you this way. Drying your cannabis is really just what it says. You want to get the moisture out in a quick fashion and to constantly have the moisture going down. If you have an increase in moisture in your drying room, you're inviting in a lot of problems like molds and mildews, and you don't want that in your crop. You just took all this time to grow this, lots of energy and love into cultivating your plants, and you want to make sure that you get that stored away in just the right way so you can enjoy that for up to 2 years or more. If you properly dry, cure, and store your cannabis, it's easily at a high quality for up to 2 years or even over 2 years. So in the drying process, as you pull the moisture out of the plants, you'll get to a point where the moisture might be right in that range that you're looking for. And I would say that range is between 55 and 65 roughly. And that's actually moisture content in the cannabis, but you can relate that to relative humidity in the room. Those numbers are somewhat interchangeable. As long as your drying room is sealed well, those numbers are even more interchangeable. So the difference between drying and curing kind of happens right around that phase when you feel like the cannabis is between that 55 to 65 range, maybe on the lower side 50 to 55, and it's been there for a few days. That process should take you 2 to 3 weeks, and you want to hold that moisture low, 50 to 55% for a few days, say 3-4 days, and then curing starts when you take the cannabis from the drying area and put it into an enclosed container where the moisture content will then start to increase because the flower will start to pull a little bit more moisture from the stem. Now, a way that you can tell when you're ready to switch and when your plants might be dry enough, it's really an old trick and it's about the best one I know. It's when the stem will snap inside the bud. So you know when your plants are dried and you're ready to switch to curing when the stem inside the bud snaps when you give it a little pull like that. You can hear it pop, it snaps. That's what you want. You still want the herb to be spongy and feel like it's a little bit wet, just 50 or 55% moisture still, but you want the stem to be able to crack. That's when it'll be totally dried just right and complete. So here's another Gromwie tip for the day. Something I see a lot of farmers and growers do in their first harvest, they make a big mistake of drying their cannabis in a room that has contaminants in it, or in a space that has other things you wouldn't want your cannabis to smell or taste like in that same space. So if you think about it like this, your buds and flowers are like a sponge. So when you harvest that, as it dries out, it starts to take on moisture, flavors, smells, and other particles from the room or space that it's in. So once your cannabis is getting dry enough, it's really going to start to taste and smell like whatever's in the room with it. So you're going to want to keep your cannabis in a clean room that doesn't have things that like, say, gasoline or paint cans or old dirty laundry or even old nutrients and things like that, because fish emulsion might be really good for the roots of your plants, but if you dry your cannabis in a room that has fish emulsion in it, ew-wee, I don't think you're gonna like the outcome of that. So what you're gonna wanna do is make sure the space is clear. I hear a lot of people these days talking about their weed's gas, and it smells like gas, and it's real gassy. And I understand what they're getting at. It really is pungent and it jumps out there. But for me, when I was growing up, we were smoking brickweed on the East Coast. And that stuff was stored in different things to be smuggled around. And I recall some of the herb that we used to get would smell like diesel fuel sometimes, believe it or not. And so when someone says their weed smells like gas, to me, it brings me back to that moment. Some of the equipment you're going to need while drying your cannabis could be dehumidifiers and heaters and things that you kind of have to make an investment into. It's a little more expensive, and it's something you want to make sure you make the right purchase on. Now, depending on your drying space, whether it's outdoors in an old barn, an old shed, a shipping container, underground in some kind of old box truck, it could be in an attic, in a basement, inside a house, in a garage, or a grow tent, or anywhere really. I've seen all kinds of stuff. And a lot of those have different requirements for what you would need to get your humidity level or moisture level in your cannabis down. So really that's your main goal. So if you have a home and you have a thermostat in your home and you have a heater in the house, there's a real good chance that you might not need a dehumidifier. It really depends on how much cannabis you've grown and now need to dry. It depends on how big the space is that you're drying the cannabis in, and it depends on if there's other environmental controls in that space or not. One important thing to know about a dehumidifier is that most of them have a reservoir in the bottom of them or somewhere in the device itself. This reservoir collects the moisture that the dehumidifier pulls from the air. Now, depending on how much cannabis you have, you're going to pull tons of moisture from the air. One major flaw that I've seen too many Gromies make is to let their reservoir fill up and then the dehumidifier shuts off. So the reservoir fills up, the dehumidifier shuts off, and now you're out camping for 2 days because you thought you could pull that off, and your cannabis has just been sitting there collecting moisture, and now the mold and mildew becomes a factor for your drying cannabis, and that's the worst thing. You could lose your entire crop that way. You want to make sure that you check that very frequently, and in most cases it's best to take the reservoir completely out of the dehumidifier and connect a drain hose or tube to the drain spout. So if you have the drain hose coming out of your room and draining away from where all the cannabis is, then the dehumidifier can constantly run and always pulls the moisture out. You always want to do it in the dark. Keep your cannabis drying in the dark. You don't want to do it in the light. And so a dark, cool place is best for drying and curing. Drying, if it's a little warm, that's no problem. 55 to 70, 75 degrees is a good range for drying. And curing, a little cooler. You want to cure somewhere in the 50 to 65 range is best for curing. And then storing any temperatures below 55 and in the dark, you're going to be best. So I'm in Humboldt County today, and the environment here in Humboldt most of the year is perfect for curing and storing and even drying. So people kind of dry the herb in the mountains and out in the hills where it's a lot drier and sunnier and hotter, and then you bring it into town and you cure it in town a little bit more and you store it away. And that's why that Humboldt County chronic jumps out of the jar and just pow, hits you like that, because the terpenes are preserved. So when it comes to hanging your cannabis, you could use just about anything. And again, it depends on how much you have and how big your space is and how things are configured to choose the right thing. But I've seen cannabis hung on everything from old stalks of plants, some old yarn that your cat knocked under the couch, clothes hangers. Some growers and farmers like to use trellis netting. Some folks like to use fishing string. When your plants get really big, you might need things like metal wire or even chains to hang your 15-foot tall 6 crops that you grew out in your backyard in McKinleyville. You can grow your own 6 in California. They could be 6 little tiny ones, or you could grow 6 15-foot tall plants. So you could need anything from yarn to chains to hang your cannabis. So those are all the different things you could use to hang your cannabis. And there's lots of really cool crafty tools out there. We have these hanging baskets. There's a series of layers of them, and it all seals up and they dry and you can hang it all from one hook, and it zips up, and it has a fan on the side of it, something real fancy. But that's a really nice thing. If you're trying to conceal what you're doing and you don't have a lot of space, something like that can really save a lot of space. Okay, so you've got your dry enclosed space all ready and all your equipment's in there ready to dehumidify and dry out your cannabis, but you have to bucket down off the plant still. You've got to go grab a pair of pruners and start to lop the plant apart into smaller sizes that fits for your space. Some people have 15-foot tall plants, and they might dry their plants in their 20-foot tall barn, and they just do them whole plant, and that might work out great for them. But most folks that are growing their own 6 plants are growing a plant that's probably 6 foot tall or less, and they're gonna buck them down into pieces that are 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 foot tall to hang them and dry them and get them ready for curing and the final phases there. So one pro tip I've got for you is to get some rubber gloves, especially if you have other people helping you or if you haven't handled cannabis before. Many people have allergic reactions to the cannabis oil and the different things on the plant while harvesting and pruning the plants. Some folks like to use facial coverings to keep those same oils from going into their lungs or being on their face and things like that as well. Personally, I get a really mild reaction myself, and it doesn't really bother me to the point of where I want to wear gloves and stuff like that. I kind of feel one with the plant that way. But most people that I've seen that get the reaction, it seems to be really unpleasant, more like a rash sometimes. So a pair of rubber gloves is really good. Another good reason to either use rubber gloves or to keep your hands clean while harvesting, post-harvesting, and packaging your cannabis has a lot to do with spreading contaminants around. You could spread around molds and mildews that might end up growing in your drying room or in your curing containers or even in your packaged cannabis if you haven't done things right and kept the moisture content constantly going down. So wash your hands, wear rubber gloves, and if you notice that you're touching mold or something funky on some of the plants you're harvesting, get rid of that stuff, clean yourself up really good before you go then spreading that same stuff around to other plants. That could help you save a whole crop or a whole bunch of plants. And so now once your weed is dry, the drying process looks a lot like the curing process, except it's done on a micro scale more so. Where the drying is done in a more open area, lots of air movement and things moving around. The curing process, typically, you don't have air movement. But when you take your cannabis from your dry phase and you're transitioning to the curing phase, you'll take the cannabis down off of your hanging devices or out of your nets, and you'll put it into a container. The cannabis will increase in moisture as it's enclosed in that container. And when you open that, you'll be doing something called burping. A lot of cannabis farmers and farmers know this burping. It's part of the curing process where the moisture will start to build up in the enclosed container, and then you'll take the lid off or you'll open the lid up for a short period of time to let that moisture out, and then you'll close the lid back up. This is a very slow process. This might take 2 to 6 weeks or even 8 weeks. Some people cure their cannabis for a couple of months. And it's a slow process. It happens differently in every environment, and each farmer has their ways of doing things to their liking. So the burping process is opening that container or taking the lid off, and you want to do that in a room that has a lower humidity than what is desired in the cannabis itself, or exactly that humidity. You don't want to try to burp your cannabis while curing it in a wet room, because every time you open the container up, as I mentioned earlier, your drying cannabis acts like a sponge. So if you have cannabis that's about 50% humidity, and you open it into a room that's 85% relative humidity, the cannabis is going to take on more moisture and you're going to be going backwards. So be careful while you're curing not to bring on more moisture. You just want to be kind of slowly letting moisture out of these different containers that you might use. Boveda makes 2 moisture control packet percentages that we highly recommend for drying, curing, and storing your cannabis. One's at 55%, the other one is 62%. And the 62% would be ones you would add to cannabis that might be a little lower than you wanted. But for me, I love the 55%. That's where I'd like my cannabis to be, especially in Humboldt where the ambient humidity is typically higher than that. So every time I open my containers, I'm pulling some moisture in. So I have a 2-way Boveda moisture control packet. 55% continues to pull that moisture right where I want it to be, which is perfect for curing and storing. And so there's a difference between long-term storage and short-term storage. The difference really is you want to store your cannabis for short-term usage in smaller containers and containers that you're going to easily open and close often. Your long-term storage could be sealed, it could be locked away, it could be under the ground in a wine cellar with all your wine just sitting there waiting to be pulled out at just the right time or just the right moment. Whether you're storing your cannabis for long-term or short-term, I prefer and I recommend using glass jars. You can use your basic preservation jars, have nice seals on the lid, you can tighten them up, they're inexpensive, and that's what I recommend. You can always put your weed in a bag too. It wouldn't be the first or last time somebody's done that. You could use a seal meal as well. They work very well for preserving cannabis for long periods of time. The jar is a little bit better because it doesn't kind of crush the herb at all. It leaves it fluffy and it allows for the herb to have its natural look. So if you're worried about that or you want to preserve it that way, that's probably the best way. If you want to join us for our next episodes, I'll be talking to you about how to save the terps, what terpenes are, and why you should start to speak Terpenese.